Hello again and welcome to Better Business Bureau Serving Connecticut. If this is your first time watching the show, I'll tell you what to expect. Our main topic is the marketplace and what BBB and state agencies do to protect and educate consumers like you about scams and help you to prevent consumers and businesses protect themselves from criminal activity, whether it's over the telephone, at your front door, or on the internet. Right now, I'm pleased to introduce you to someone Better Business Bureau has worked with for several years. It's the Staff Counsel for the State Department on Aging and the co-chair of the Coalition for Elder Justice in Connecticut, Peck Llewellyn. Welcome to the show, Mimi.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the State Department on Aging. So that consumers understand, well, we're all consumers. How does the Department of Aging interact with consumers in a way that other departments would not?
Well, Howard, we are focused on the needs of older people in Connecticut, and that has expanded to those folks with disabilities as well. And we are funded by the Older Americans Act, the federal government. Most of our funds come from. And they fund us to be able to accommodate programming and services for older people throughout the state. And we work with the 5 area agencies on aging who contract with providers in each of their regions.
So from a practical point of view, if you had to give an elevator speech, on a day-to-day basis, what does the State Department on Aging take care of?
We direct consumers to the appropriate locations that will provide them with services.
And that can be challenging sometimes for people to negotiate their way through the government?
Oh, very much so. We get calls from people who maybe think that we should be providing them their service, but in fact another department does. For instance, the Department of Social Services or Department of Public Health, and we are able to direct them to the appropriate location so they're not calling a list of thousands.
And when we're talking about the elderly, I prefer to say the experienced, we are talking about a huge segment of the population that's approaching 60 or 65, and that's the baby boomers. And do you expect to see the services that are required or requested by them, you expect them to evolve at all or change as a result of this huge bubble that's coming up?
Well, we currently have about 580,000 in Connecticut. We know that that population is increasing and the need for services will increase as well. The same when we started providing services probably 40 years ago, the kinds of services needed has evolved. And we have to be considerate of cultural needs and the actually not so much the end-of-life needs, but different needs start at age 60 than they used to.
Do you see any sort of difference? You mentioned cultural differences. Because we're such a multicultural country, do you see any differences in the approach to the elderly from other countries as opposed to folks who are from the United States?
Well, we do find quite a difference in how various populations have treated older people. So some actually believe it is their responsibility to care for their older elders in their homes, where others are not as reticent to be able to send mom and dad into community housing. What we do know is that the trend of older persons now is that they want to be cared for at a home atmosphere. So we're looking at that and saying, okay, how do we accommodate that in a a way that we can help fund, and that has not always been the case. It's been government funding went to nursing home care, and now we are backing that off and saying, okay, how would older persons really want to be treated, and it is in the home environment.
Now, when we were brought up, 60 or 65 was considered old. We were different. We weren't perhaps not as savvy about street issues as the baby boomers are. Is that something that will make it different to help them because they're different than perhaps my folks, myself, my grandparents?
I think there's a great difference, and one of it is that one of the biggest issues that we hear from older people is relative to their safety, where that wasn't an issue when my parents were growing up, or when I was growing up and my parents or their parents, there wasn't this fear, and that is a major concern of the baby boomer generation, is to make sure that they have safe communities and that they are protected. I think one of the major issues has been in abuse, which is one of my favorite topics, unfortunately, where we have abuse by family members, and that may be caused by the drug saga going on. I think perhaps the baby boomers are the last generation that has money that their children or their friends would think was accessible, and therefore that becomes a major aspect of our concern for abuse and financial abuse, which is the fastest growing type.
I'm glad you brought that up, because for the folks who don't know, you and I met because you're the co-chair of the Coalition for Elder Abuse in Connecticut. I wonder if you can give us a thumbnail about the work that the coalition's doing and who's involved in it.
Well, in 2013, when the State Department on Aging was reestablished, we looked at what the major issues were and discovered that the issue of abuse wasn't only of an issue that in the Department on Aging we were concerned about, that in fact many state departments dealt with various of the issues of elder justice and elder abuse, and nonprofit organizations and other entities, universities, medical associations. And we decided that there's only a little funding to go around, and why didn't we combine our efforts to be able to look at what are the most important problems and then work together to alleviate them.
As I understand from working with you and the coalition, is that we're trying to put into place the same infrastructure as we would have for child abuse and spousal abuse. But we're talking about the elderly now, and what is it that really prompted this movement?
Well, we found out that unlike children, older persons, and particularly in the current greatest generation, were reluctant to tell anyone that they may be abused, and therefore reporting was way less, maybe only 1 in 23 that this suspected abuse would be reported. And we had to start from scratch to be able to make older people aware, and actually younger people as well, that there was no shame in reporting. That in fact, the evidence about reporting elder abuse was that not only was there the direct impact, if it was physical or money, but there was also a continuing impact, and it caused poor health. People were dying sooner, and it's probably, we determined that it's probably 25 years difference between where child abuse is now and where elder abuse is. So we actually had to create that awareness. We had to create where do you report, who takes the reports, who the police structure, the prosecutorial structure, and in fact, this has been extremely difficult because there was no coordinated effort.
Now, you do have a website and a phone number. We'll give that at the end of the show. One of the things I noticed being on the coordinating council of the coalition is the number of different departments that are involved. And one of the examples I'll give is first responders, or let's say nurses who would be as well at the front of the line. Even now, in 2016, it's still necessary to educate others about the signs of elder abuse.
Oh, yes. We have statutory language now that we call mandatory reporters, which has been expanding so that it was mandatory reporting, but not necessarily mandatory training. So doctors, clergy, nurses, people who work with older persons have become mandatory reporters, but the training wasn't in place. We don't have banks on the list, and what we've done is the coalition has started what we call an action team about financial exploitation and bank training. So now we're looking at, okay, how do we train these mandatory reporters and what other aspects are needed?
There's a wide spectrum of issues involving elderly abuse. And I know that, for example, you brought Better Business Bureau on to deal with the issues in terms of financial abuse. Some folks might scratch their heads and say, what is financial abuse of the elderly?
Well, it can come in several forms. One is scams that say, hey, you've won $1 million, and however, you have to pay us $3,000 up front. And an older person would go to the bank, withdraw the $3,000, go to a money sending place like Western Union and send it and be waiting for their prize. That's one type of abuse. And unfortunately, that's like a circular impact, because once you're targeted as somebody who is a believer, then you're targeted for everything. There also is in banks where folks chum up to an older person and say, hey, we need to get so much money, you need to give it to me or I'm going to put you in a nursing home. And that's just dreadful. Dreadful, and in that aspect, it's your family. So we have those kinds through scams and fraud, family. It's a matter of if, and by training bank tellers and bank personnel, this is still a generation where older people go to the bank, and on a frequent basis. If we give the warning signs and train bank personnel to notice, it could be not financial abuse, but it could be physical abuse, it could be neglect. We are hoping that we can raise the level of being able to report. We report all signs of the folks in the middle are protective services for the elderly. And when someone suspects that an elder is being abused in one of the many forms, that they call the protective services for the elderly, and they're the ones that go out to investigate. They bring in other partners like the police, like the Office of the Chief State's Attorney, like the prosecuting attorneys throughout the state.
Now, we know as consumers they're vulnerable. We know that sometimes they don't have the strength or the ability to go out and shovel the driveway, and people will come around or they'll point to the roof and say, you've got a couple of shingles loose, maybe take a hammer, bang a few holes and say, this is going to cost you a lot of money. This happens to a lot of folks. It also happens to folks who are 60 and older, but they don't have the same equipment to deal with these types of things. And one of the things we've discussed is that it's not just a question of who shows up on your doorstep or who calls you, but a very sad situation in which the abuse is taking place within the home itself by a member of the family.
Exactly. And although people and older people don't want to call up and say, my son is doing this, or my son has a drug problem and he's doing this to me, it's most of the time it's a familial holding the older person hostage, meaning I will put you in a nursing home, or who do you think would take care of you, or if you don't do this, then I'm going to be toted off to jail. And so it's all a matter of, a lot of times this ends up being an emotional hostage, where they don't want to see anything bad happen to their family, so they sit in silence.
So, in fact, the problem can worsen because the member of the family who's neglecting them or abusing them feels somewhat invulnerable.
Right, and so it's a matter of, it isn't, too often older people think it's their fault. They're afraid to tell family members when they've been scammed, and I get telephone calls from older folks, and it's terrible to say to them, I'm sorry, you're not going to get back your money. You know, this is a scam. We have one called the Grandparent Scam, where Nigerian entrepreneurs and folks on the Canadian side call up and say your grandchild or your son has been in an accident or has been picked up, and you need to send money fast, and they do because they don't want to see harm coming to the family. But when I have to say to somebody, I'm sorry, you're not going to get your money back, do you think have you talked to your son or daughter? And they say, no, I'm too embarrassed. So it's trying to overcome the embarrassment. In child abuse, no one would think twice about reporting because they look at a child as a vulnerable individual. Well, some older folks are that and more vulnerable. So it's a matter of saying, okay, what causes, and I know there's a lot of research now going on, is there a certain brainwave that, or certain, like folks with dementia, how do we know whether they are competent enough to make decisions like the vacuum folks that come around to their house, and the older person doesn't realize that they're signing up for a $900 vacuum. Are there certain signs, and should we be looking at the signs that would lead to incapacity and make someone more vulnerable?
We have time for just another question or two. When we're talking about these types. It's a very, very complex subject with many tentacles, if you wish. What is the take-home message for folks who are watching this right now?
My recommendation is that if someone suspects that a neighbor or a family member is neglecting themselves, is being abused by someone, and the word abuse I use loosely because it requires a decision-making capacity, but that it doesn't hurt to make one call. And in fact, the state statutes indicate that a caller or a reporter is exempt from disclosure. So I say call. The call you make could save someone's life.
Great. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, as I'm sure all the folks out there do. And that's it for this edition of Better Business Bureau Serving Connecticut. Once again, I'd like to thank our guests, the Staff Counsel for the State Department on Aging, as well as the Co-Chair of the Coalition for Elder Justice in Connecticut, Peck Llewellyn, for joining us. So BBB and I would like to thank Nutmeg TV and each and every one who works here for this opportunity to share our experience with you and hopefully help protect you and your family. You can share what you've learned today, we're hoping you will, with members of your family and friends and colleagues and neighbors, because education is the ultimate tool to protect ourselves from criminals who would do their best to deceive us and threaten us into giving up our personal information and our money. If you have a marketplace dispute and you want to inquire about a particular business or professional, you can learn more about consumer and marketplace issues at bbb.org, and we'll give you the website and other information to contact us in just a moment. I'm Howard Schwartz. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.